Welcome to another edition of We Won, Let's Eat. This is Lonnie Goldsmith from TC Jewfolk, and have a special guest joining me this week. We have from Bethel Synagogue in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, Rabbi Avi Olitzky. Rabbi, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
So we weren't planning when, Matt and Bradley and I sat down and planned season 1 of this podcast. We weren't planning to do anything on Sukkot, mostly because we don't really know Sukkot foods. And Matt was telling you this, and you're like, no, you have to do a Sukkot episode. So you're here to help lead us through Sukkot, or into Sukkot, with the best foods for the holiday, which is traditionally you invite people to your home, and you sit outside in your sukkah, and you enjoy a meal together.
Yeah, I think that there are a few different pieces to it. One, I would make the case that Sukkot has to be a Jewish food holiday simply because of how long it is, right? So as opposed to, these are the foods we serve for Rosh Hashanah, right? And you have one meal, maybe 2 meals for dinner or lunch, whatever it might be. Sukkot, it's sort of like Pesach. You have your Seder meals, but there are all these Passover foods, and likewise Sukkot foods. So on one hand, you've got the family staples. On the other hand, you've got the holiday staples, and there are other pieces. Yeah. During Sukkot, and this is true really of all, Yom Tovim or all Yontifs, all holy days, there's a tradition of not just bounty, but food that represents bounty.
Okay.
And so when we talk about food that represents bounty, we talk about doubling. Now, there's a little bit of that on Shavuot. There's less of that on Passover, and it really is highlighted on Sukkot.
Okay.
So I don't know if you grew up with this tradition, but many in an Eastern European tradition grew up with what they call halishes or halishkas, which are stuffed cabbage.
Okay.
And stuffed cabbage is the idea of something stuffed into something else. And that is very much a traditional Sukkot dish. Second to that is kreplach, right?
Yes.
Now, something stuffed into something else. If you're not a carnivorous family, then obviously something like Morningstar stuffed into cabbage is a good option. So we could get into more.
No, and as we talked to Matt and Bradley and I talked about in the Rosh Hashanah episode, was kreplach growing up was part of my family's Rosh Hashanah tradition.
Correct.
It's one of these staple memories I have of the family rolling out the dough and making hundreds for the two nights that we would host.
For sure. And I think part of that is because for so many people, they talk about the high holy days, and what's the definition of high holy days? They say, high holy days is Rosh Hashanah. High holy days is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur.
Right.
High holy days is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Sukkot. High holy days is Rosh Hashanah Yom, right? And for me, it's a whole month of Tishrei,
right,
really. And so you have some people who, in some traditions, once you had freezing and refrigeration, you cooked in August, and what you cooked in froze is what you served for the entire month of Tishrei, effectively.
Right.
And so you might be serving the same kreplach you prepared on Rosh Hashanah, for Rosh Hashanah you prepared for Sukkot. Now, that said, I'll tell you 2 sides of that same coin. So you have this doubling. So it's not uncommon in my sukkah that you will find at least one night we're doing stuffed cabbage. You will find one night that we might be doing some sort of ravioli or tortellini.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a lot of fall and harvest flavors, a lot of pumpkins, a lot of squash, a lot of apple, and part of that, again, is the bounty of this harvest that we're, admiring and celebrating as part of the agricultural roots of the holiday. But then the other side of that is really this notion of inviting people into your sukkah. And so when we talk about inviting people into our sukkah, what we call ushpizin, these spiritual holy guests, is not just inviting our ancestors, but anyone else who would like to be there. And one of the things we do in our home is not just do we invite them, but we invite different cuisines. And so it's pretty infrequent that a year goes by that we don't have at least one night, for example, that the entire dinner is Indian cuisine, or the entire dinner is Japanese cuisine, or the entire dinner is something, as far-fetched as classic or ancient Greek, right? Like we try to do different pieces to kind of bring something foreign into the room.
And that's something that we talked about, and we're getting ahead of ourselves a lot, but the Tu B'Shvat Seder that Bethel annually does, we talked before last year's Seder that's something you try to do, and we'll get more into that on a different episode. We'll talk at length about that. Now, you talk about the Olitzky traditions. You come from your brother's a rabbi, your father, of course, is a rabbi also. Are these traditions that he and your mom started that you've now passed on to your kids, or are these sort of adaptations that you've picked up along the way?
Yeah, I think it's like all of the above.
Okay.
Certainly there are traditions that, my father had in his family, and my mother had in her family, both coming from, relatively Reformed traditions, and I don't mean that from observance, but from affiliation.
Okay.
And then they coming from very, Orthodox immigrant traditions, the balance of which then translates to, I think there's a lot of Hasidic influence in my family. And when I say Hasidic, I don't mean ultra-Orthodox or Haredi. I mean Hasidic, like the Baal Shem Tov, the Kedushas Levi, Rabbi Nachman, a lot of the teachings from the, that period and their customs and traditions. And so the idea of looking at these holidays as kind of metaphysical experiences and how to transform our table into some sort of holiday altar, well, then the food becomes a different type of appeal altogether.
Sure. So you mentioned the kind of foods you do. How far out do you tend to plan? Because you tend to sounds like theme it a little bit more, and there's a little bit more, involved than maybe a lot of people would consider doing. How far out are you planning for? Like, do you already have your sort of menu put together for that week?
Oh yeah, I could tell you. You want to hear my menu for I'll tell you my menu.
Yeah,
for first
I think
night
we'd all
Yontif.
like to hear it. Let's hear it.
My menu for first night Yontif right now is at least I'm working on this, but this is what it is in theory. It's a pumpkin curry soup with toasted pepitas, and that's the idea of doubling the pumpkin.
Sure.
Then there will be some sort of a vanilla poached pear candied pecan salad. Again, switching from the savory to the sweet to match the change of the seasons to match that. Then, because in my home we always do a cheese course, but not for dessert. We always do it earlier because we're vegetarian, so it's good to do a cheese course. The idea of a savory brie, because again, the multiple layers of Yom Tov, and again, the doubling of bounty. Then we'll probably be doing a pomegranate onion salmon, taking the pomegranate from the season.
Yep.
Try to work in all of the 7 species throughout the meal. A roasted Brussels sprouts with Parmesan and truffle oil, some sort of jeweled rice, and probably, although I'm debating it, some sort of kind of cubed sweet potato with, again, some sort of spice blend that takes, not just heat, but also the flavors of the season, whether it's with toasted almonds or things like that. And there's no dessert on that list yet because that I haven't figured out yet.
So that's quite the involved menu, it seems like. How have you started prepping for that, or does that happen once Yom Kippur finishes?
Yeah, this type of year, it's sort of once Yom Kippur finishes, and the way that the holiday works this year, it's a little bizarre because there's not much time to build the sukkah. You've got Shabbat in between, you've got Shabbat dinner in between, you've got all of those different things. So this is probably going to be a Sunday day of cooking. Maybe some Saturday night. It doesn't talk about baking the challahs as well, and trying, what chalot are we going to do to kind of theme that, and how to balance that. But I think that, in terms of menu planning is something that I've always, and I get that from my mom, the foresight. We talked about Rosh Hashanah menu a month, 2 months before Rosh Hashanah. Some people say, oh, Rosh Hashanah's coming. I know Rosh Hashanah is coming when I sit down and actually not start working on sermons or something, but like, what's the menu? And then I go to the farmer's market and I get a different feel for, what's around and things like that.
So do you start the Rosh Hashanah menu planning first or the sermon first?
It's funny. I think there's probably a combination of the two. And the reason is, my Rosh Hashanah sermon, my Yom Kippur sermon, that happens all year long.
Right.
Different things will happen, and I have a folder on my computer. I put notes. Little notepad files.
Notes app on your phone.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with the menu.
Okay.
There'll be something that I'll come across. I'll say, oh, I definitely want to do that for Yontif this year. That's a perfect example. And by the way, the other side of the equation is not just the food, but it's the decor. I mean, I've got bins and bins of Sukkot accoutrement, plates that say, with leaves that say thankful and harvest and gratitude and things like that, those only come out for the sukkah, and that's also the sukkah meal.
Right. And having had the privilege of spending a Shabbat meal in your sukkah, it's it is a to-do.
Well,
and it was delicious.
Thanks.
For sure. So you mentioned the 7 species. I want to go back to that for a sec. For people who don't know, what are the 7 species?
Sure. Now you're putting me on the spot. Let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. Not in the order, but it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8.
Okay.
It's pomegranate, wheat, barley, olive. You're keeping track, right?
Yeah.
Pomegranate, wheat, barley, olive, grape, honey, which is debatable if it's date or bee honey.
Okay.
So that's where you get 8 species, basically.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Almond. Is that 8?
That's 8.
I think that's all of them.
Okay.
So that must be all of them. And then, there are... I mean, you could easily Google 7 species salad.
Mm-hmm.
And there are umpteen recipes and dressings to do a wonderful salad that would be apropos for Rosh Hashanah or Sukkot that have all 7 species worked into it. And there's actually, I don't know if it's a Tunisian or Moroccan tradition that actually makes a salad with the 7 species.
Oh, that's really
My
cool.
mom makes a 7 species rice, a jeweled rice, which we actually served this year on Rosh Hashanah. That is actually a Sephardi tradition that has all 7 species incorporated into it. It's pretty yummy.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That sounds great. So what are some sort of easy ways? Obviously, probably in part because you're a rabbi, in part because you love to cook and, really get involved in the whole thing. It probably is a little more than the average sukkah building Jew might do. But what are some ways that, sort of simple ways that you could recommend that people could sort of start their own traditions and sort of build up, maybe, if that's what they're looking to do?
Yeah, I think step 1 is eating the meal in the sukkah, right? Step 2 is taking your meal up 1 notch from the day prior. And so to be clear, if that means take out pizza, and for this meal you get extra toppings or you get extra cheese and you're serving it on fine china, okay, you've taken it up a notch and you've doubled.
Yes.
Right? Now, if we're talking about a little bit more of a gourmand, standpoint, that's a different story.
Sure.
Maybe yesterday was take out pizza and for
you're
Yontif,
making
you're making
your
your own. Exactly. You're making your own. That's exactly right.
Okay.
And instead of doing the thin crust from Cub, that you're warming up,
That's right.
you're making your own dough, or the pizza stone in the oven, right? That piece. But I think in terms of what other people can do their own, open up Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8.
Okay.
Look at the list of the species and, highlight those ingredients. Because it could be, and that's what we do for Tu B'Shvat, which we've talked about, and we'll talk about later this year, which it could be that there are already menus that people are making and don't realize are appropriate for Sukkot. But at the end of the day, and this was part of one of my sermons, I think on second day Rosh Hashanah, the idea of kavanah, of intention.
Right.
If the menu has intention, it's already a quote-unquote holier menu. It's already a tastier menu. It's already a better menu, right? It's when you just throw a dinner together that, of course, it's not going to be as delicious as it possibly could be. So if you have the intent that this is for Yom Tov, this is for Sukkot, this is a Sukkot dish, it's already a step in a different direction.
Well, excellent. Well, Rabbi Avi Olitzky, thank you for joining me this week and giving us some tips and explaining a little bit more about the holiday than just, it's obviously more than just the one with the huts. So,
that's right. Unless it's Pizza Hut, I guess.
I think you can always find better pizza huts.
That's we could do an entire series on pizza.
Oh,
that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation. Well, Rabbi Olitzky, thank you very much. Shana Tova, and thank you for joining us this week.
Only good things. Only good things.
We won Let's Eat. The Jewish Food Podcast is a product of Jewfolk Inc. Email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com or find Fancy Dinner Club on Instagram at Fancy Dinner Club. Music for the show is from Dan Israel and his new studio album, Social Media Anxiety Disorder. Get more information at danisraelmusic.com.